The year was 1881. The wind came first, a dry broom sweeping down from the barren mesas, pushing a sheet of red dust before it. It scoured the valley, rattling the loose shutters on the general store and whistling a mournful tune through the gaps in the weathered planks of the church steeple. In Sagebrush Crossing, the wind was a constant sermon, preaching a gospel of thirst and patience. Dust wasn't just on the ground. It was the air you breathed, a fine grit that coated your tongue and settled in the lines around your eyes. It hung in the afternoon light like a bloody curtain, turning the world the color of rust and old regrets. Through this haze, a figure emerged, a man on a horse, both the color of ash and weariness. The horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Ash, walked with its head low, its gait the slow, steady rhythm of a creature that had measured too many miles. The rider, Coulter Hale, sat slumped in the hot leather of the saddle, his tall, lean frame folded against the relentless sun. A year's worth of trail dust was ground into his duster, clinging to the fabric like a second skin. His hat was pulled low, its brim casting a deep shadow over a face that was all sharp angles and sun-baked leather. He rode not like a man arriving, but like a man surrendering to an inevitable gravity. He had been gone a year of running, of working distant cattle drives where no one knew his name, of sleeping under stars that offered no solace. Now, the rope of his past had pulled him back. The town saw him long before he reached the first building. Sagebrush Crossing was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen sun-bleached structures, a saloon with swinging doors that never quite shut, a livery stable that smelled of hay and horse sweat, the blacksmith's forge, the bank, and the small pine church. Eyes watched from behind grimy windows and parted curtains. Whispers, dry as autumn leaves, skittered down the street, faster than the wind. It's Hale, Coulter Hale. Thought he was dead. Worse, heard he killed a man up at Gray Fork, the foreman. Shot him dead. Just like that. The story followed him. A ghost riding at his side. It was a story that had grown with each telling, its edges sharpened into a weapon. Half of it was true, half of it was saloon talk. But in the West, the difference between the two could get a man buried. Coulter felt their stares like physical things, small pebbles hitting his back. He kept his eyes fixed between his horse's ears, his jaw a hard line. He wasn't here for them. He wasn't here for forgiveness or a fight. He was here because the Blue Coyote Ranch, his family's land, was all he had left, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers like fine desert sand. He swung down from Ash in front of the livery, his worn boots making no sound in the thick dust. His movements were economical, weary but sure. He handed the reins to the stable boy, a skinny kid with wide, curious eyes. "Just water," Coulter said, his voice a low rasp, rusty from disuse. "He's earned it." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked across the street, his spurs a soft, lonely jingle in the heavy silence. The forge was at the far end of town, its wide doors thrown open to the heat. The rhythmic, ringing clang of a hammer on an anvil was the town's heartbeat, a steady, industrious sound against the sigh of the wind. Inside, where shadows danced with firelight, Eliza Hart worked. She was not a large woman, but she moved with a strength and certainty that made her seem taller. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was braided and pinned up. Those stray wisps clung to her sweat-sheen temples. Her arms, bare to the elbow, were corded with muscle, her face smudged with soot. She lifted the heavy smithing hammer high, her eyes, the gray blue of a stormy sky, fixed on the glowing piece of iron she held with a pair of long tongs. The hammer fell, and a shower of bright orange sparks erupted, dying almost as soon as they were born. She didn't seem to notice Coulter standing in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the blinding glare of the street. She was lost in her work, in the rhythm of heat and force, shaping metal to her will. Behind her, in a small, partitioned-off room at the back of the smithy, another sound vied with the clang of the hammer. It was a sharp, insistent clicking, the sound of the telegraph. Eliza was the town's blacksmith, but she was also its connection to the world beyond the valley, the one who translated the coded whispers that traveled along the singing wires. The two sounds defined her: the raw, physical power of the forge and the precise, intellectual clatter of the key. One shaped the world you could touch. The other brought news of the world you couldn't see. Coulter's attention was pulled away by a sudden crack, loud as a pistol shot, from the center of the crossroads. He turned to see Reverend Greer's buggy lurch to a halt. One of its rear wheels canted at a sickening angle. The Reverend, a kind man with a face creased by worry and a perpetually dusty cassock, stood beside the broken vehicle, looking at the splintered axle with a sigh of resignation. Without a second thought, Coulter moved. It was a problem he could solve, a straightforward piece of trouble that required muscle, not words. He walked over to the buggy, his eyes assessing the damage. "Axles split clean," he said to the Reverend, his voice still rough. "Coulter, it's good to see you, son," Reverend Greer said, his surprise genuine, "though I wish the circumstances were more pleasant." Coulter just grunted, already squatting down for a closer look. He grabbed a loose piece of timber from a nearby stack and, with a grunt of effort, wedged it under the carriage to take the weight off the broken wheel. His duster pulled tight across the lean muscles of his back. It was simple, physical work, a language he understood. He heard footsteps in the dust behind him and knew, without turning, that it was the blacksmith. He could smell the faint scent of coal smoke and hot metal that clung to her. "Reverend," Eliza Hart said, her voice clear and calm. "Looks like you found a rut." "Indeed. Eliza, this old buggy has seen better days." Coulter looked up then. Eliza stood there, holding a heavy hammer in one hand as if it weighed nothing. Her gray-blue eyes met his. There was no judgment in them, no fear, just a straightforward appraisal. She looked at him, then at the broken axle, then back at him. She saw a man, and she saw a problem. For a moment, the whispers and the rumors faded, replaced by the simple reality of the task at hand. "Hold the wedge steady," she said to him, her tone practical. "I'll knock the wheel free." He nodded, repositioning his hands on the timber brace. She moved to the other side of the wheel, her skirt brushing against the dust. She swung the hammer, not with the full force she used on the anvil, but with a series of short, precise blows. The sound was a dull thud against the wooden hub. Coulter held the brace, his muscles straining, the heat from the sun-baked ground radiating up through the soles of his boots. He watched her work, the focused line of her jaw, the way her braids swung with each movement. Sweat traced a path through the soot on her cheek. They worked in silence. A man who ran from his past and a woman who hammered her future out of fire and iron. For a few long moments, they were just two people fixing a broken thing. Across the street, in the cool, dim interior of the saloon, faces pressed against the glass. The bartender, a man named Silas, who polished the same spot on the bar all day, paused his work. A few ranchers, nursing warm beers, squinted into the glare. "Look at that," one of them muttered. "Hale ain't been in town 10 minutes, and he's already kicking up dust. He's helping the Reverend," another countered. "Maybe," Silas said, his voice low and cynical. "Or maybe he's just making a show. A man with a reputation like his needs to look useful. People are wondering if he came back looking for more trouble, or if he's trying to buy his way back from it." With a final, solid crack, the wheel came loose from the axle. Eliza lowered her hammer, breathing a little heavily. She wiped her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving another streak of grime. "That's it," she said, her eyes meeting Coulter's again over the top of the broken buggy. A bead of sweat ran from his temple down his jaw. For a second, caught in the quiet space between the wind and the work, there was an understanding, a recognition of shared effort, a language spoken in strained muscles and the smell of iron dust. Then the moment broke. Coulter stood up, brushing the dust from his hands onto his trousers. "You can fix the axle?" he asked, his voice directed at Eliza. "I can forge a new one. It'll take a day," she replied. He nodded, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a few coins. He pressed them into Reverend Greer's hand. "This should cover it," he said, his gaze not quite meeting the Reverend's. "Coulter, this is too much. You don't have to." But Coulter was already turning away. He had fixed the immediate problem, paid his due, and now he was retreating back behind his walls. The connection, fragile as a spider's web, was severed. He gave a short nod that encompassed both the Reverend and Eliza, then walked back toward the livery, his shoulders set in a way that discouraged conversation. Eliza watched him go. She saw the stiffness in his back, the way he walked as if expecting a blow. The men in the saloon saw a killer, a troublemaker, a ghost from a violent story. Reverend Greer saw a troubled soul in need of grace. But Eliza, who understood the nature of stress and breaking points, who knew how to find the flaws in a piece of metal before it snapped, saw something else. She saw a man bound so tightly by his own past that he could barely move. He was like a horse that had been hobbled for too long, still walking as if the ropes were there, even after they'd been cut away. She watched his tall frame disappear into the shadows of the livery stable, a man carrying a wound so old and deep it had become a part of his bones. She turned back to the broken axle, the weight of the hammer in her hand feeling suddenly, profoundly heavier. The ride out to the Blue Coyote was a journey through memory. Every rise in the land, every cluster of sun-scorched rock, held an echo of a life that was no longer his. He passed the flat-topped butte where he and his brother Dean had dared each other to climb during a thunderstorm, their laughter swallowed by the immense, rumbling sky. He saw the dry creek bed where they'd hunted for arrowheads as boys, their pockets heavy with smooth, worthless stones that felt like treasure. The land hadn't changed, but a filter had been placed over it, draining it of its color, leaving only the gray of loss. The ranch itself was a punch to the gut. The gate hung from a single hinge, groaning in the wind. The corrals, which had once held 100 head of cattle, were empty save for a few gaunt, thirsty-looking animals that eyed his approach with dull indifference. The grass in the home pasture was chewed down to the dirt, cracked and barren. Weeds choked the horse trough. He swung down from Ash, the silence of the place pressing in on him. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a working ranch at rest. It was the hollow silence of decay, of a heart that had stopped beating. He walked to the well near the main house, its stone lip worn smooth by years of rope and hands. His mother's hands, Dean's hands, his own. He looked down into the darkness, but he didn't need to drop a bucket to know. The air that rose from it was stale and shallow. The water was low, everything was running dry. And then he saw it, nailed to the thick central post of the porch, a single piece of paper, stark and white against the weathered gray wood. It was a formal notice from the Sagebrush Crossing Bank. He didn't need to read the fine print. He knew what it was. The looping, confident signature at the bottom belonged to Silas Dodd, the town banker. Coulter tore it from the post, the nail screeching in protest. The words swam before his eyes: 30 days. The final payment on the loan his father had taken out years ago was due. Default, and the property, along with all its assets, including water rights, would be forfeit. The paper felt heavy in his hand, heavier than a stone, heavier than a gun. It was a death sentence written on credit. He didn't have to wait long for the vulture to circle. The next afternoon, as Coulter was patching a section of fence with wire and weary hope, a smart black buggy pulled up the lane. Silas Dodd stepped out, a man who seemed immune to the dust and heat. He wore a tailored black coat, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the board and all the pieces on it. "Hail," Dodd said, his voice smooth as a polished stone. He didn't offer a hand. "I see you received my correspondence." Coulter stopped his work, coiling a piece of wire in his hand. He said nothing. Dodd smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "I trust you're making arrangements. The railroad is pushing west. Land with reliable water will become exceedingly valuable. The mesquite well on your northern pasture, for instance. A man who controlled that could be very prosperous." The threat was clear, wrapped in the language of opportunity. It wasn't just the ranch Dodd wanted. It was the water, The mesquite well was the deepest and most reliable on this side of the valley, fed by a deep spring that never faltered, even in the driest years. It was the lifeblood of the Blue Coyote. "The debt will be paid," Coulter said, his voice flat. "I'm glad to hear it," Dodd replied, though his eyes said he didn't believe it for a second. 30 days can pass quickly out here. Hail, the sun comes up, the sun goes down. Before you know it, it's foreclosure day. A word of advice: don't cause any trouble. The town values peace and prosperity. He gave a pointed look at the desolate ranch around them, then got back into his buggy, leaving Coulter standing in a cloud of dust and quiet rage. Miles away, in the heart of town, a different kind of economy was at work. Eliza Hart hammered a glowing horseshoe into its final shape, the rhythmic clang a familiar comfort. An old rancher paid her with a sack of potatoes and a promise of fresh milk for a week. A young mother gave her 2 bits for mending a cast-iron skillet. The money was a trickle. Not a flood, but it was enough. Her last customer of the day was little Ruthie, the preacher's daughter, a girl of 6 with bright, inquisitive eyes and a solemn face. She held up a small, bent tin soldier. He fell off the porch. "Miss Eliza," she said, her voice a small whisper. "His leg is crooked." Eliza took the soldier and examined it with the same seriousness she would give a broken plowshare. "A serious injury," she pronounced gravely, "but I believe we can save the patient." She didn't charge Ruthie a cent. Instead, after she had gently straightened the soldier's leg with a pair of small pliers, she wiped her hands on a rag and pulled out a small, worn slate. "Now," she said, her voice softening, "payment is due. Show me your letters." For the next 10 minutes, as the forge cooled and the light outside began to fade, Ruthie painstakingly scratched out the alphabet, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Eliza watched, correcting a misplaced curve on AB, praising a perfectly straight L. This was her other work, forging not just metal, but a future for the children who had no school to go to. She was building something more durable than iron, a defense against the ignorance that left people vulnerable to men like Silas Dodd. As evening settled, the saloon began to fill. The air grew thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. In a dark corner, Marshall Pike was already on his 3rd whiskey. He was a big man, running to fat, his face perpetually flushed. The silver star on his vest was tarnished, much like the authority it was supposed to represent. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, just staring into his glass and letting the words spill out. "Water," he slurred, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "It's a funny thing. A man can't live without it, but you get in too deep and it'll pull you under. You get involved in other folks' water and you're liable to get swallowed whole." He took a long drink, his eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to meet his gaze. No one did. They had all seen him leaving Dodd's bank, his shoulders a little less slumped than when he went in. They knew who paid for his whiskey. The marshal's words sparked a low murmur through the room. A group of ranchers were talking about the rumor Eliza had heard over the telegraph wire. Railroad wants to buy up water rights for the steam engines. One said, "Offering good money. It's devil's money." Another grumbled, "Sell our water. And what are we left with when the railroad decides to move its station 2 towns over? We'll be left with dust." That's what the town was divided. The promise of railroad money was a powerful temptation in a place so starved for cash. But giving up control of the water felt like selling their own souls, one bucket at a time. Out at the Blue Coyote, night had fallen completely. A sliver of moon did little to push back the profound, endless dark of the plains. Coulter sat on the porch steps, the unread loan notice clutched in his hand. He had done nothing all afternoon but stare at the decay of his home. Now, in the dark, the sounds of the ranch came alive, the creak of the windmill, the distant, mournful lowing of a lone steer. It was the sound of the cattle that did it, a sound so familiar it was part of his blood. It was the sound of work, of life, of Dean. He closed his eyes and he could almost feel him there, a solid presence in the darkness beside him. He could almost hear his brother's easy laughter, see the flash of his grin in the moonlight. Dean had loved this life, loved the hard work and the open spaces. He had never wanted to be anywhere else. The emptiness in Coulter's chest was a physical ache, a hollowed-out space that was shaped exactly like his brother. He had run for a year, but he hadn't outrun this. The ghost of Dean was here, in the whisper of the wind through the dry grass, in the lonely call of the cattle. Back in town, Eliza lit a lamp in the small room behind the forge. The last telegraph message of the night lay on her desk. It was from a surveyor's office in Cheyenne, a routine confirmation of a pending survey route, but it wasn't routine to her. She read the coordinates again, her finger tracing a line on the county map she kept pinned to the wall. The proposed route for the new railroad tracks cut directly through the barren hills on the north side of the valley. And the proposed site for a water tower, marked with a small red X, was less than 100 yards from the mesquite well. Dodd's words to the ranchers, Pike's drunken warnings. Coulter's sudden return, the pieces began to click into place. She sat down at her small desk, took out a leather-bound journal and a pen, and dipped it in the inkwell. The flame of the lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, the town was quiet, its secrets hidden by the darkness, but secrets, like water, had a way of finding a path. She wrote, the scratch of the nib the only sound in the room. Go deeper into the truth. She wrote, water and blood always flow to the lowest point. The past doesn't stay buried. It breathes. On a quiet night, you can hear it rustling in the dry grass, whispering on the wind that slides down from the mountains. For Coulter Hale, it was a constant low hum beneath the silence of the Blue Coyote Ranch. He tried to busy himself with work, with 1,000 small repairs the place demanded. He mended fences, cleared the water trough of a year's worth of grime, and reshod ash, his movements methodical, his mind desperate for the blankness of physical labor. But the past was patient. It waited in the familiar heft of a tool, in the scent of the air just before dusk. He was in the small, dusty tack room, sorting through a pile of old leather, when his fingers brushed against it, a faded blue kerchief tied around the handle of a broken branding iron. It was stiff, almost brittle, caked with the salt of old sweat and the grime of hard work. Dean's. He had tied it there years ago, a makeshift grip, and never taken it off. Coulter picked it up. The fabric was rough against his calloused thumb. He closed his eyes, and the smell of dust and old leather was suddenly replaced by the cold, heavy scent of rain and wet earth. 3 years ago, the world was a churning chaos of mud and water. A summer storm had broken with savage intensity, turning the dry arroyos into raging torrents. They were trying to move a small herd to higher ground, fighting a losing battle against the driving rain and the panicked, scattering cattle. Dean was laughing, a wild, joyful sound swallowed by the thunder, his face slick with rain in the brief, flickering glare of lightning. Just a little farther. Brother, he'd yelled, his voice thin against the roar of the wind. The ground gave way without warning. A section of the creek bank, undercut by the floodwater, simply collapsed. One moment, Dean was there on his horse, a solid shape in the maelstrom. The next, he was gone, swallowed by a churning, muddy wave. Coulter saw the flailing arm, heard a cry that was half shout, half gurgle. He had his rope. He swung it, his arm clumsy, his fingers numb with cold. The loop sailed out, fell short. He recoiled it, his heart hammering against his ribs. A frantic, wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. He swung again. This time, Dean's hand shot up, grabbed it. Coulter pulled, digging his heels into the slick mud, the rope burning through his gloves. For a second, a single, agonizing second, he had him. He felt the weight, the desperate resistance, but his footing was slick, his grip unsteady. The rope slipped, just an inch, a fatal loss of purchase. It was only a beat, the space between one frantic breath and the next, but it was enough. The current was a merciless, powerful thing. It pulled Dean under, ripping the rope from his grasp and from Coulter's. He saw his brother's face one last time, eyes wide with shock in the flash of another lightning strike, before the brown water closed over him. Coulter was left holding a slack rope, the rain washing the mud and tears from his face in equal measure. He had been a single heartbeat too slow. The memory slammed into him with physical force. He opened his eyes. Back in the dusty tack room, the blue kerchief a dead weight in his hand. His own breath was ragged in his ears. He had failed. In the one moment that mattered more than any other, he had failed. That failure had poisoned everything that came after. It followed him north to the Gray Fork Ranch, where he'd taken a job trying to outrun the ghost in his head. The foreman there, a man named Cowboy, was a bully who ran his crew with threats and a heavy hand. An argument had started over a lame horse, a small thing that grew hot and ugly in the afternoon sun. Cowboy had a temper, and he'd been drinking. He lunged at Coulter, his face contorted with rage. Coulter did what he'd been taught to do, de-escalate, but be ready. He drew his pistol, but he didn't aim it at the man. He fired a warning shot into the dirt, the sound cracking through the tense silence. It was meant to stop the fight, to make Cowboy think, but the foreman, startled by the gunshot, stumbled backward. His boot heel caught on an exposed tree root. He fell awkwardly, his head hitting a large rock with a sickening final thud. The other ranch hands saw Coulter with a smoking gun in his hand and their foreman dead on the ground. The story wrote itself. It was simpler that way. Easier to believe in a cold-blooded killer than in a clumsy, tragic accident. The rumor took root, grew wild, and chased Coulter from town to town, a fire he could never quite stamp out. He was no longer a man who had been too slow to save his brother. He was a man who was quick enough to kill. The two failures twisted together, forming the heavy chain he now dragged behind him. Across town, Eliza Hart wrestled with a ghost of her own. The massive leather bellows of her forge had finally given out. The hide cracked and torn after decades of use. Replacing them was a job for two strong men, but she had only herself. Grunting with effort, she used a system of levers and blocks to hoist the heavy wooden frame of the new bellows into place. Sweat dripped from her chin, her arms and back screaming with the strain. Her hands, protected by thick leather gloves, were already calloused and strong. But this was a test of raw, sustained endurance. As she worked, her eyes fell on a small, intricately carved wooden box on a high shelf, a box she hadn't opened in years. It held the last remnants of a different life, a life with Dr. Alistair Finch. He had come to Sagebrush Crossing with a medical bag full of modern instruments and a head full of promises. He was handsome, gentle, with smooth, clean hands that seemed so different from the rough, capable hands of the men she knew. He'd courted her with poetry and talk of a future in a city back east, a future of clean dresses and civilized society. They were to be married. Then her father, a man whose strength she had thought was as endless as the sky, had fallen ill. His lungs, filled with a lifetime of coal dust, had finally failed him. He'd left her the forge, the house, and a mountain of debt, including a substantial water loan from Silas Dodd. The doctor, who had spoken so eloquently of sickness and health, had no stomach for the sickness of poverty. He'd offered his condolences, his face a mask of regret, and had taken the next stagecoach out of town, leaving her with the debt, the forge, and the quiet humiliation of being abandoned. His promises had turned to dust as soon as hardship appeared. The memory no longer brought tears. It brought a slow, burning resolve. She shoved the heavy bellows frame into its final position with a last, desperate grunt. It settled into place with a solid thud. She leaned against the cool stone of the forge, breathing heavily, her knuckles scraped, her muscles trembling. The rumors about Coulter Hale were just words, whispers on the wind. She understood something about men who ran, but she also understood the quiet strength of those who stayed, who faced the broken things and found a way to fix them. Her own resilience, born of necessity and grief, gave the town's gossip a hollow, weightless sound. Later that day, Reverend Greer stopped by, carrying the newly repaired axle for his buggy. He watched her for a moment as she secured the final fittings on the bellows. "That's heavy work for one person. Eliza, he said, his voice gentle. It needed doing. Reverend, she replied, not looking up from her task. Most things do, he agreed. He paused, leaning against the doorframe. I saw Coulter Hale this morning. He carries a heavy burden. Eliza finally stopped, wiping her brow with her arm. The whole town is talking about it. Talk is cheap, the Reverend said, his eyes kind. People are afraid of what they don't understand. But running from a thing only makes it seem bigger. You know, the truth is like a tent peg. Eliza, it hurts like the devil when you first drive it into the hard ground, but once it's in, it's the only thing that will hold the tent up in a storm. His words settled in the quiet space between them, and Eliza knew he wasn't just talking about Coulter. That night, Coulter couldn't stand the silence of the ranch. He saddled Ash and rode into town, tying him outside the saloon. He needed noise, distraction, the burn of cheap whiskey to silence the ghosts. He took a seat at a corner table, his back to the wall, and ordered a bottle. The liquor was harsh, but it was honest. It promised numbness, and for a little while, it delivered. The low murmur of conversations, the clink of glasses, the tinny piano music. It all blended into a dull roar that kept the memories at bay, but you can't drink away a smell. A cattleman, unsteady on his feet, stumbled near Coulter's table, sloshing beer from his mug onto the dusty floorboards. The scent rose up damp wood, stale alcohol, and something else. Something green and earthy that reminded him of wet grass after a storm. It was enough. The saloon walls dissolved, and he was back on that muddy creek bank, the rain lashing his face, the smell of the wet earth, the slick, living smell of the flood, a single heartbeat too slow. He shoved his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the floor. The saloon went quiet. Every eye turned to him. He threw a few coins on the table, not looking at anyone, and walked out. The silence he had been running from following him into the street. The wind had picked up, cold and sharp. It funneled down the single street of Sagebrush Crossing, carrying with it the scent of dust and the promise of a long night. Coulter stood by his horse, one hand on the saddle, breathing in the cold air, trying to clear his head. Across the street, a gust of wind pushed open the wide door of the blacksmith's forge, which had been left ajar. It swung inward with a low groan. For a moment, the interior was dark. Then, a match flared, a tiny spark of defiance against the overwhelming dark. A lamp was lit, and a soft, steady glow filled the doorway. Eliza stood there, a solitary figure framed in light, her shadow long behind her. She hadn't gone to bed. She was awake. Like him, two worlds, separated by a street of dust and shadows. A man haunted by the things he couldn't hold on to, and a woman defined by the things she refused to let go. Both of them sleepless in the heart of a town that was holding its breath. The first sign of trouble was the thirst. It was in the low, agitated bawling of the cattle, a sound that settled deep in Coulter's bones. It was in the way they crowded the trough at the main well, pushing and shoving for the meager, muddy water he was able to draw. But the real alarm came when he rode out to the mesquite well. For as long as he could remember, the water there had been deep and constant, the level barely changing from the wettest spring to the driest summer. Now, it was different. He lowered the bucket on its long rope, listening. The splash came sooner than it should have. When he hauled it up, the water was still clear and cold, but there was less of it. He could see the damp line on the stone wall of the well, a good 2 feet above the current water level. The land was bone dry. There had been no rain, yet the well was dropping as if an invisible giant were drinking from it in the night. It made no sense. Water didn't just vanish. It had to go somewhere. He spent the day checking the other, smaller springs on the ranch. All were low, lower than he'd ever seen them. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Without the mesquite, the Blue Coyote was just a parcel of worthless, sun-baked dirt. Dodd's 30-day deadline felt like a countdown to execution. In town, Eliza was sorting the afternoon mail that had come in on the stagecoach. Among the letters and parcels was a long, cylindrical tube addressed to the Sagebrush County Land Office. It wasn't an official office, just a dusty corner of her telegraph room where maps and deeds were stored. The tube had been sent from the Union Pacific Surveyor's office in Cheyenne. Curious, and remembering the telegraph message from the night before, she carefully uncapped it and slid the contents out onto her desk. It was a detailed topographical map of the valley. A proposed railroad line was drawn in sharp, black ink, snaking through the northern hills, and there, just as the telegraph had indicated, was a small, precise red X's marking a proposed water tower. Her eyes followed the contour lines, her blacksmith's knowledge of the local landscape guiding her. The red X was located on a small, flat mesa, a mesa that belonged to Silas Dodd. It was situated on higher ground, overlooking the northern pasture of the Blue Coyote Ranch, overlooking the Mesquite Well. She stared at the map, the pieces falling into place with a cold, sickening click. The railroad needed water. Dodd owned the land for the tower. The only reliable water source for miles was the spring that fed Coulter Hale's well. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. That evening, as dusk was bleeding the color from the sky, she walked not to the saloon or the church, but to the livery stable. Coulter was there, brushing down ash, his movements slow and tired. "Hale," she said, her voice quiet in the hay-scented air. He turned, his expression guarded. "Ma'am, the Mesquite Well," she said, getting straight to the point. "Your water level, is it low?" His eyes narrowed. The guarded look was replaced by a sharp, sudden focus. "How did you know I think I know why?" She didn't show him the map, not here, not where anyone could walk in. "The spring that feeds it, it starts up in the foothills. Doesn't it follows the old dry wash down through the canyon?" He nodded slowly, his gaze locked on her face. "That's right. Meet me there," she said, "at the head of the canyon, an hour after sundown. And don't let anyone see you." He didn't ask why. He didn't question her. He simply looked at her, saw the grim certainty in her eyes, and gave a single, decisive nod. 2 hours later, they met under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. Coulter was already there when she arrived, a ghost on his gray horse, melting into the shadows of the canyon walls. They tethered the horses in a thicket of mesquite and proceeded on foot, moving up the narrow, winding path of the dry creek bed. Coulter led the way, his steps silent and sure on the rocky ground, a lifetime of tracking and hunting ingrained in his movements. The air was still and cool. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the incessant chirping of crickets. For half a mile, the creek bed was just as it had always been, a scar of pale sand and smooth stones snaking through the sagebrush. Then, Coulter stopped dead. He held up a hand, and Eliza froze behind him. He was looking at a place where the canyon wall jutted out, creating a natural bottleneck. It looked different, fuller. The brush seemed thicker, piled up unnaturally. He moved forward cautiously, Eliza a few steps behind. It was a dam, a new one, cleverly built and brutally effective. It was made of earth and rock, packed tight, and disguised with a covering of uprooted sagebrush and dead branches to make it look like a natural landslide. It stretched from one side of the narrow wash to the other, completely blocking the path of any water that might flow down from the spring in the hills. Coulter swore, a low, vicious sound under his breath. He scrambled up the side of the dam. On the other side, where a deep pool should have been collecting from the slow trickle of the spring, there was only a basin of damp, cracked mud. The spring had been cut off. As Eliza climbed up beside him, her foot slipped in the soft, newly turned earth. She put her hand down to steady herself and looked at the impression her boot had made. And then she saw it, another print, larger and deeper than her own, baked hard by the afternoon sun. It was a man's boot, worn at the heel, and in that heel was a clear, unmistakable flaw, a V-shaped crack, like a tiny, broken horseshoe. Marshall Pike. She breathed, the name a puff of cold air in the night. Coulter knelt beside the print, his face a grim mask in the faint moonlight. "I've seen him wear those boots 100 times. The heel plate is broken. The law itself was a party to this." The realization landed with a heavy, sickening thud. They were utterly alone. Suddenly, Coulter stiffened, his head cocked. He pressed a finger to his lips. Eliza held her breath, straining to hear what he had heard. At first, there was nothing but the crickets. Then, she caught it. A faint, rhythmic sound from over the ridge. The soft scrape and thud of a shovel hitting the earth. They moved like shadows, skirting the edge of the dam and climbing the low ridge that separated the Hale property from Dodd's. They crawled the last few yards on their bellies, the sharp rocks and dry twigs digging into their skin, peering through a thick screen of creosote bush. They saw the source of the sound, in a hollow on the other side, hidden from the main valley. 2 men were working by the light of a single lantern. They were digging a trench, channeling the water that had pooled behind the dam into a deep, newly dug reservoir. Standing on the edge of the pit, overseeing the work, was one of Silas Dodd's bank clerks. But it was what lay on the ground beside them that caught Eliza's attention. A stack of long, narrow wooden pipes. As she watched, the 2 men laid a section of pipe into the trench. One of them produced a bucket of thick, black liquid and began daubing it onto the joints, sealing them. A faint, acrid smell drifted toward them on the night air. Pine tar. Eliza nudged Coulter, pointing. She didn't need to speak. This wasn't just a temporary dam to steal a bit of water. This was a permanent, engineered system. A pipeline to systematically drain the spring that fed the mesquite well and divert it entirely onto Dodd's land. Ready for the railroad. The sight of it, the sheer, calculated audacity of the theft broke something in Coulter. The quiet dread that had been simmering in him all day erupted into a white-hot, silent fury. This wasn't just about water. It was about the slow, deliberate murder of his family's legacy. It was Dean's ranch they were killing. He saw the foreman at Gray Fork stumbling backward. He saw Dean's face in the floodwater. He felt that old, familiar helplessness. The feeling of being a step too slow, a moment too late, but not this time. His hand moved, a blur of motion in the darkness, and the smooth, worn handle of his Colt was in his palm. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnaturally loud in the quiet night. He started to rise, to step out from behind the cover of the bushes. His face set, his eyes cold and empty. He was done with talking. He was done with waiting. Before he could take a single step, Eliza's hand shot out and clamped down on his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her blacksmith's fingers digging into his flesh. "No," she whispered, her voice fierce and low. He tried to shake her off, his eyes still fixed on the men in the hollow. "They're stealing our water, Eliza, right in front of us." "And what will you do?" she hissed, her face close to his, her stormy eyes blazing even in the dim light. "Shoot them! Shoot the marshal when he comes to arrest you for it. They'll hang you. Coulter, Dodd wants you gone. Don't you see? This is what he wants. He wants you to do something rash, something he can use against you. We need proof. We need witnesses. We don't need more bullets." Her words cut through the red haze of his anger. She was right. He would be playing right into their hands. A dead body or 2 would solve all of Dodd's problems. He slowly, reluctantly, eased the hammer of his pistol back into place and holstered it. The tension went out of his shoulders, replaced by a weary, bitter frustration. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed rage. "We can't just let them do this." "No," she said, her mind already working, calculating. We prove it." She looked back at the dam, then at the nearly empty basin behind it. "They're diverting the water at night. By morning, all this will be gone, channeled into their reservoir." She reached into a small pouch she wore on her belt and pulled out a piece of chalk she used for marking metal. She crawled back to the edge of the muddy basin on their side of the dam. There was a large, flat rock at the edge of where the water had pooled. She found the high water mark, the faint line of dampness showing where the level had been, and drew a thick, white line. "There," she whispered, her voice tight with purpose. "That's where the water is now." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. "We come back at first light, before anyone else is awake. The water level will be even lower. We'll have our proof of how much they're taking in a single night." Coulter looked from the chalk mark to her determined face. For the first time since he'd returned, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the solid, reassuring feeling of a plan, of a fight. He nodded, his jaw tight. First light, he agreed. They slipped away as silently as they had come. Two conspirators leaving the scene of a crime, leaving the slow, steady work of the shovels to continue in the darkness. The trap had been set. The theft was in motion. And now, the race against the dawn had begun. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a dark gray softening to a pale, luminous pink at the eastern horizon. The air was cold and still, in the false dawn. Sagebrush Crossing was a town of ghosts, its buildings silent, skeletal shapes against the growing light. Coulter was already awake, sitting on the edge of the horse trough at the livery. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night wrestling with the image of the dam, the stolen water, and the cold fury that simmered in his gut. He was waiting for the sky to lighten just enough for him and Eliza to ride out to the canyon, to document the night's theft. A sound cut through the pre-dawn quiet. Not a gunshot, not a saloon brawl, but something far more chilling, a scream of pure, unadulterated panic. It was a man's voice, ripped from the throat, a sound of absolute terror that shattered the morning peace. Coulter was on his feet instantly, his hand instinctively going to his hip before he remembered his gun belt was looped over a saddle in the stables. The scream came again, followed by a woman's cry of alarm. It was coming from the direction of the forge. Doors were thrown open, figures, half-dressed and bleary-eyed, spilled out into the street. Coulter ran, his long legs eating up the dusty ground. He rounded the corner of the general store and saw a small, frantic crowd gathering behind Eliza's smithy. Reverend Greer was on his knees at the edge of the old stone well, his face a mask of horror. His wife stood beside him, her hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "My baby," the Reverend was crying, his voice cracking. "Ruthie." "She's down there." Coulter pushed through the small cluster of onlookers. He looked down into the black, circular mouth of the well. It was an old one, narrower than most, lined with rough, uneven field stones. A small wooden bucket lay on its side near the edge, its rope trailing down into the darkness. Far below, he could just make out a faint glimmer of water, and something else, a patch of pale color. She was just getting a bucket of water for the morning. The Reverend choked out, his eyes wild. The wood, the planks covering it must have been rotten. I heard her cry out, just once. The townspeople stood frozen, a collection of helpless, horrified statues. They stared down into the hole as if it were a grave. Who could fit down there? The rope was old and frayed, meant only for the weight of a small bucket. Eliza was already moving. She appeared from the forge, her face pale, but her expression set with grim determination. In her hands, she carried a coil of new, thick rope, the kind she used for hoisting heavy iron bars. "The pulley's old, but the axle is sound," she said, her voice sharp and clear. Cutting through the panic, "The rope is strong enough to hold a man." Her eyes met Coulter's over the heads of the crowd. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an assessment of a problem. In that moment, he wasn't the outcast, the rumored killer. He was the only one there with the lean frame and the wiry strength to even attempt a rescue. Without a word, Coulter began stripping off his heavy duster. He tossed it to the ground. The crowd parted for him as he walked to the well's edge. He took the new rope from Eliza, his hands testing its thickness, its strength. "Tie a bowline around my waist," he said to her. "Double it." Her hands were quick and sure, her knowledge of knots as practical as her knowledge of metal. While she worked, Coulter leaned over the edge, calling down into the darkness. "Ruthie, can you hear me? Honey, it's Coulter Hale. We're coming to get you." A small, weak sound floated up from the depths. A cough, followed by a faint, terrified whimper. She was alive. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Eliza finished the knot and cinched it tight and low on his hips. "It'll hold," she said, her voice low and steady. meant for him alone. Coulter took a deep breath. He looked down into that black hole, and for a half-second, the image of a churning, muddy river filled his mind, the feeling of a rope slipping through his grasp. He shoved the memory down. Hard. This was not a river. This was a well. This was not a memory. This was now. He sat on the stone lip of the well and swung his legs over. He gripped the rope, his knuckles white. "Lower me slow," he said, his eyes on Eliza. She and two of the stronger-looking ranchers gripped the other end of the rope, wrapping it around the creaking wooden axle of the pulley for leverage. The descent began. The world narrowed to the rough, circular column of stone. The morning light above vanished, replaced by a shrinking circle of pale sky. The air grew instantly cold, damp, smelling of wet rock and a deep, ancient chill. His boots scraped against the slimy, moss-covered stones, dislodging small pebbles that rattled down into the darkness below, each one landing with a tiny splash. It was tighter than he had expected. He had to brace his shoulders against the walls to keep from spinning. He could feel the rope biting into his hips, the entire weight of his body suspended over the black water. He passed the frayed end of the bucket rope. Lower. The darkness was absolute now, broken only by the faint, shimmering reflection of the sky on the water's surface. His boots touched the water. The cold was a physical shock, a jolt that went straight through his leather boots and up his legs, making him gasp. The water was only up to his knees, but it was frigid. He looked around, his eyes struggling to adjust. "Ruthie," he called out, his voice a strange, hollow echo in the confined space. A sob answered him, so close it made him jump. I'm cold." He saw her then. She wasn't in the center of the well. She was wedged in a small, cramped space where the stone lining had partially collapsed years ago, creating a narrow alcove just at the waterline. The rotten plank had fallen with her, and she was clinging to it, her small body trembling violently, her face streaked with tears and grime. She was pinned by the fallen timber, her legs submerged in the icy water. The bottom of the well was a mess of soft, thick mud and fallen rock. It sucked at his boots as he tried to move toward her. The space was so tight he couldn't turn properly. He had to press his back against one wall and shove himself sideways. He finally reached her, the cold water swirling around his thighs. "It's okay, Ruthie," he said, keeping his voice as calm as he could. "I'm going to get you out of here." He tried to move the heavy, waterlogged plank, but it was wedged tight against the rocks. He couldn't get enough leverage. He set his shoulder against it and pushed, his muscles straining, the rough stone scraping his cheek. The plank shifted. "Just an inch," Ruthie cried out as the movement jostled her. He pushed again, gritting his teeth, feeling a moment of rising panic. He was stuck. He couldn't get her free. The darkness, the cold, the memory of another failure, another child he couldn't save. It all pressed in on him. "Coulter." A voice from above. "Eliza." It was calm, clear, carrying down the stone shaft as if she were standing right beside him. "What is it?" "The timber," he called up, his voice tight. "It's got her pinned." "I can't shift it." There was a pause. The only sound was the drip of water and Ruthie's quiet, hitching sobs. He felt the old instinct rise up in him, the urge to give up, to admit defeat, to run. Then Eliza's voice came again, softer this time, but with an intensity that cut through his fear. It was a strange thing to say, a phrase that made no logical sense in the moment, but it struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Go deeper, Cowboy," she called down, her words echoing in the stone chamber. "But this time, don't run from what you find. Don't run from what you find." It wasn't about the well. It was about the muddy riverbank. It was about the foreman at Gray Fork. It was about the ghost of his brother and the shadow of his own failure. It was about this moment. Right here, in the cold and the dark. He had a choice. He could let the panic take him, or he could go deeper. He took a ragged breath, the icy air burning his lungs. He ignored the plank for a moment. He looked past it, deeper into the narrow alcove. There had to be another way. He dropped to one knee in the freezing water. submerging himself to his waist. He reached under the water, his hands feeling along the collapsed rock wall behind Ruthie. His fingers found a gap, a small underwater opening where the foundation stones had shifted. It was a long shot. "Ruthie, I need you to be very brave," he said. "I'm going to pull you under the log, just for a second. Can you hold your breath?" She nodded, her eyes wide with terror, but also a flicker of trust. "Okay, on 3. He positioned himself, getting as low as he could. 1, 2, 3. He took a deep breath, plunged his head and shoulders under the frigid water, and pulled her down and through the gap. For a terrifying second, they were both submerged in the black, icy water. Then they were through. He surfaced, sputtering, pulling her up with him. She was free. She coughed and gasped, clinging to him like a burr. Her small, cold arms wrapped tightly around his neck. He held her for a moment, his own body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. He had done it. He hadn't been too slow. He hadn't run. "She's free," he yelled up the well shaft, his voice hoarse with relief and triumph. "Haul us up slowly." The rope tightened. The slow, arduous journey back to the light began. He held Ruthie tight against his chest with one arm, using his other hand and his feet to brace them against the walls, protecting her from being bumped and scraped. The ascent was harder than the descent, a deadlift against gravity. He could hear the rope groaning as it scraped over the wooden pulley, hear the grunts of effort from the men above. He imagined Eliza, her hands raw, her muscles straining as she pulled with all her strength. Finally, a brilliant, blinding circle of light appeared above them. He squinted, and the light resolved into a ring of anxious faces peering down. He was almost there. Hands reached down, grabbing his arms, grabbing Ruthie. He was lifted the last few feet and half stumbled, half crawled onto the solid ground, blinking in the morning sun. He collapsed to his knees, utterly spent, setting Ruthie gently on the ground. She was immediately swept into her parents' arms, wrapped in blankets, her name a chorus of relieved prayers. Coulter stayed where he was, his head down, water pooling in the dust around him, his body shaking uncontrollably. He had gone into the deep, dark place and come back. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. It was Eliza. She knelt in front of him, her face smudged with dirt, her hair coming loose from its braid. She held a clean cloth in her hand. She said nothing. She simply reached out and gently pressed the cool, damp cloth to a bleeding scrape on his forehead. Her touch was gentle, practical. Her gray-blue eyes met his, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze. And in it, he saw not pity, but a profound and quiet understanding. He became aware of the silence. The entire town was watching them. But the whispers that now moved through the crowd were different. They were not the furtive, condemning whispers of before. They were murmurs of awe, of respect. They had seen him not as a rumor, but as a man. They had seen him face the darkness and bring a child back into the light. The story of Coulter Hale was being rewritten, right here, in the dust behind the forge. The cowboy, they would later say, knew how to go down into the deep places, and not just how to draw a gun. The moon rose that night like a raw wound in the sky. It was a swollen, dusky red, bathing the barren hills in an unnatural, bloody light that made familiar shapes seem predatory and strange. A hunter's moon. Down in the valley, a cold wind snaked through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It was a night for secrets, a night for thieves. Crouched behind a jagged outcrop of granite overlooking the hidden dam, Coulter felt the tension in the air like a change in pressure before a storm. He lay flat on his belly, the cold of the rock seeping through his thin shirt, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. Beside him, Eliza was a study in stillness, a dark shape blending into the deeper shadows. She held a heavy smithing hammer in her lap, its polished head faintly gleaming in the crimson moonlight. It was a strange weapon for an ambush, but it was the tool of her trade, an extension of her own formidable will. They had been waiting for 2 hours, silent and patient. The rescue at the well had changed things. It had forged a bond between them, a shared purpose that needed no words. They both knew Dodd wouldn't give up. The failed rescue attempt would make him reckless, more determined to secure his prize before the town grew any bolder. The sound came first, a faint, rhythmic grating that was not a natural sound of the night. The crunch of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on loose stone. Coulter touched Eliza's arm, a light pressure, and she nodded, her eyes already fixed on the narrow track that led to the dam. A minute later, a heavy-duty wagon, its cargo covered by a dark canvas, creaked into view. It was pulled by 2 mules, their hooves muffled with burlap sacks, a classic smuggler's trick. 3 men walked alongside it, their shapes dark and anonymous under the blood-red moon. They were Dodd's men, hired muscle from out of town, faces no one in Sagebrush Crossing would recognize. Coulter and Eliza watched as the men pulled the canvas back, revealing more sections of the pine-tarred pipe and digging tools. They were here to reinforce their stolen channel, to make the theft permanent. The quiet, methodical way they worked spoke of confidence, of a certainty that they were beyond the reach of the law. Just as the men began to unload the pipes, a new sound joined the night, the steady, unhurried hoofbeats of a single horse. A rider emerged from the shadows of the canyon. The moonlight glinted off the tarnished silver star on his vest. Marshall Pike. He didn't dismount. He sat on his horse like a bloated king on a shabby throne, watching the men work. The scene was laid bare, the law, present not to prevent the crime, but to supervise it. This was the moment. Now or never. Coulter put 2 fingers in his mouth and gave a soft, trilling whistle, the call of a nesting quail. It was the signal. From a thicket 50 yards away, a small covey of real quail, startled by the sound, exploded into the air. Their wings a frantic, whirring burst against the silence. It was the perfect diversion. The men looked up, startled, their attention pulled away from the path. In that instant, Coulter and Eliza moved. They scrambled down from their perch, using the noise of the birds to cover the sound of their descent. They reached the edge of the clearing just as Pike was turning his horse, an annoyed look on his face. "What in the—" one of the men started to say. "He never finished." Coulter stepped out from behind a boulder, his face hard and unreadable in the moonlight. Eliza was right behind him, the hammer held loosely at her side. The 3 hired men froze, their hands hovering near their hips. Marshall Pike's jaw dropped. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a lone, broken rancher, not an ambush. "Evening. Marshall," Coulter said, his voice dangerously calm. "Looks like you found a leak in my water supply." Pike recovered quickly, his face settling into a mask of smug authority. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Funny you should show up. Hale, I have a warrant here for your arrest. For the willful destruction of private property and vandalism." He held up the paper, its official-looking seal visible in the dim light. It was a pre-signed order from Dodd. "Turning the victim into the criminal? That paper isn't worth the spit it took to seal it," Eliza said, her voice ringing with cold contempt. She took a step forward, and the men instinctively took a step back from the sight of the hammer in her hand. "Now, Eliza, this is official town business," Pike blustered, his horse shifting nervously beneath him. "You best stay out of it." Coulter saw the flicker of movement as one of the hired hands decided to be a hero. The man's hand was a blur, dropping toward his gun, but Coulter had been waiting for it. He didn't draw his own weapon. Instead, with a flick of his wrist, he grabbed the lantern hanging from the side of the wagon. In one fluid motion, he swung it, shattering the glass against a nearby rock and sending a spray of burning oil onto a pile of discarded, tar-soaked rags the men had used to seal the pipes. The effect was instantaneous. A whoosh of sound, and a column of greasy, orange flame roared into the night. The fire illuminated the clearing with a harsh, flickering glare, painting the guilty faces of Dodd's men and the panicked face of Marshall Pike in stark relief. For a moment, everyone was frozen, mesmerized by the sudden, violent light. That moment was all Coulter needed. "Eliza!" "The dam," he yelled, and charged. The clearing exploded into chaos. The mules, terrified by the fire, reared and screamed, snapping their tethers and bolting into the darkness. One of the men fired a wild shot, the bullet whining off the rock face high above Eliza's head. Coulter didn't run at the men. He ran through them, shoving one man into another and using the confusion to get past. He and Eliza were running for the dam, but the path was blocked. The chase began. It wasn't a chase across open ground, but a desperate, scrambling flight down the steep, rock-strewn ravine that ran alongside the dry wash. Gunfire cracked the air behind them. A bullet kicked up dust near Coulter's feet. He didn't fire back. A stray shot in the dark was a fool's game. Their only hope was to get to the dam. Rocks, dislodged by their frantic steps, tumbled down the ravine, creating miniature landslides. Behind them, he could hear Pike shouting orders, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. They reached the dam, a dark wall of earth and rock in the fiery, flickering light, while Coulter turned, drawing his Colt to provide cover. Eliza went to work. She was in her element now. She ran a hand along the main timber brace that served as the dam's spine, her expert eye searching for the weak point. She found it a thick iron linchpin, driven deep into the wood to hold the central brace in place. "Cover me!" she yelled over the sound of another gunshot. Coulter fired twice into the darkness above their pursuers' heads, not aiming to hit, but to make them take cover. The tactic worked. The return fire paused. Eliza swung the heavy hammer. The sound of the blow was a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very ground. She swung again, a grunt of effort escaping her lips. The sound of splintering wood, a third swing, and the iron linchpin groaned, bent, and then shot out of the timber, ricocheting off a rock with a high-pitched scream. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a giant sigh, the main brace shuddered. A crack appeared in the face of the earthen dam. Water, black and slick in the firelight, began to trickle, then pour through the crack. The structure failed all at once. With a deafening roar, the dam gave way. A brown, churning beast of a wave, carrying with it a slurry of mud, rock, and splintered timber, surged into the dry wash. It hit the carefully constructed pipeline, tossing the tarred wooden sections into the air like matchsticks. The thieves' work was obliterated in a matter of seconds. The sudden torrent of water turned the floor of the ravine into a slick, treacherous bog. Marshal Pike, who had been scrambling down the slope to get a clear shot, let out a cry of alarm as the ground beneath his feet dissolved into mud. He lost his footing, his arms windmilling wildly, and fell, sliding down the last few feet into the churning, muddy water at the bottom. The current immediately caught him, pulling him under. He came up sputtering, his eyes wide with terror. The water, though not deep, was powerful and thick with debris. He was a heavy man, and his waterlogged coat was pulling him down. He flailed, his hands finding no purchase in the slick mud. Coulter watched from the edge. Every instinct, every bitter memory of injustice, screamed at him to let the man drown. Pike was a corrupt, worthless coward. The world would be better off without him. He deserved this. But as he watched the marshal's head go under for a second time, he saw a different face in the water. He saw Dean, his eyes wide with shock in the flash of lightning. He saw a hand reaching for a rope that wasn't there. He moved before he had even made a conscious decision. He slid down the muddy bank, plunging into the thigh-deep, churning water. The current was strong, trying to pull his feet out from under him. He lunged forward and grabbed a handful of Pike's coat just as the marshal was going under again. He pulled, his boots sinking deep into the mud, his muscles straining. Pike was a dead weight, his panic making him clumsy and useless. "Grab my arm," Coulter yelled, his voice raw. Pike's desperate hand finally found Coulter's forearm, his fingers digging in with surprising strength. Coulter planted his feet, leaned back, and pulled with everything he had. For a tense, agonizing moment, it was a stalemate. Then, with a great, sucking sound, he broke Pike free from the mud's grip and dragged him, coughing and gasping, to the relative safety of the ravine's edge. It was the choice he hadn't had with Dean. It was the choice he had made in the bottom of the well. To pull a man back from the mud, even a man who deserved to drown in it, was a strange, selfish kind of grace. It wasn't for Pike. It was for the ghost on the riverbank. Just then, the sky opened up. The rain that had been threatening all night began to fall, not as a drizzle, but as a driving, torrential downpour. It hissed against the hot embers of the fire, sending up clouds of steam before extinguishing it completely, plunging the ravine back into the darkness of the blood moon, now obscured by thick clouds. The rain fell on the broken dam, on the churning wash, on the two men gasping at the water's edge. It fell on Eliza as she stood watch, the hammer still in her hand. The flood of water from the broken dam, now fed by the storm, surged down the canyon, a cleansing torrent scouring the land. It flowed back into the old channels, back toward the parched earth of the Blue Coyote Ranch, back toward the mesquite well. Their proof was gone. The dam was destroyed, the pipes washed away, the boot prints erased. But the rain couldn't wash away what had happened. The hired men had seen Coulter and Eliza. The marshal had been exposed, and Coulter and Eliza had seen the true face of the law in Sagebrush Crossing. The evidence was gone, but the witnesses remained, standing in the cold, cleansing rain, their face turned toward a new, more difficult fight. The church was not built for justice, but for absolution. On this cold, gray morning, it was struggling to serve as both. The pews were filled with the townsfolk of Sagebrush Crossing, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a nascent, fragile anger. They sat not as a congregation, but as a jury. The air, usually thick with the scent of pine wood and old hymnals, was heavy with the smell of damp wool and mud. At the front, where the altar usually stood, a simple pine table had been placed. Reverend Greer sat behind it, his expression grave. His role today less a man of God and more a fulcrum of fairness in a town whose law had been bought and paid for. Silas Dodd stood before the table, a picture of calm, righteous indignation. He was flanked by a lawyer he'd had brought in on the morning stage from Cheyenne, a man with a slicked-back hair and a suit that cost more than most of the ranches in the valley. Dodd unrolled a large, professionally drawn map onto the table, weighting its corners with stones. "As you can see, Reverend and esteemed citizens," Dodd began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "This is the official preliminary survey from the Union Pacific Railroad. It clearly shows the proposed route and the designated site for the new water tower." He tapped a perfectly rendered red X on the map. "This is progress. This is the future of Sagebrush Crossing." He then produced Coulter's loan document, its terms stark and unforgiving, and laid it beside the map. "And this," he said, his voice hardening slightly, "is a legal and binding debt. Mr. Hale is on the verge of defaulting. His desperate, violent actions last night destroying vital survey equipment and a legally constructed water conduit were the actions of a man trying to escape his obligations." Every eye in the church turned to Marshal Pike. He stood near the door, a wretched figure of a man. His coat was still stained with mud from the ravine, a dark, damning testament to where he had been and what he had done. He fidgeted, his gaze fixed on the floorboards, refusing to look at anyone. "Marshal Pike," Reverend Greer said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "You were present last night. Did you witness Mr. Hale destroying this conduit?" Pike swallowed hard. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He was trapped. To lie was to condemn an innocent man in front of the entire town. To tell the truth was to lose his badge, his income, and the favor of the most powerful man in the county. His hand strayed to the tarnished star on his chest, a gesture of pathetic self-preservation. It was dark. "Reverend," he mumbled, his voice a hoarse croak. There was a fire, a lot of confusion. He stopped, unable or unwilling to say more. His silence was a confession, and everyone in the room knew it. Dodd's lawyer stepped forward, his smile condescending. "The marshal's caution is understandable. However, we have a signed warrant issued yesterday afternoon for Mr. Hale's arrest on charges of vandalism. The law is the law. A warrant signed before any alleged crime was committed, Reverend Greer observed, his eyes narrowing. That is unusual. He picked up the warrant, then the map. He studied the official-looking wax seal stamped at the bottom of each document. These seals, they are impressive, but they are also fresh. I propose a stay on these proceedings. 2 days. That will be enough time for the Telegraph to confirm the authenticity of this map and this warrant with the Union Pacific office and the circuit judge in Cheyenne. A murmur went through the crowd. It was a reasonable request. A lifeline. Dodd's lawyer started to object, but the banker silenced him with a sharp glance. To refuse would be to admit guilt. 2 days is acceptable, Dodd said magnanimously, as if granting a great favor. We have nothing to hide. It was then that Eliza stepped forward. She was not intimidated by the banker or his lawyer. She held something in her hand, wrapped in a piece of burlap. She walked to the table and placed it down with a solid thud. "While we're examining evidence," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to submit this." She unwrapped the burlap. It was a single, mud-caked boot, Marshall Pike's boot, the one he'd lost in the struggle in the ravine, the one she had retrieved after he and Coulter had scrambled to the bank. She turned it over, revealing the worn heel with its distinctive, broken horseshoe-shaped metal plate. The crowd leaned forward, a collective intake of breath. They had all seen the Marshal limp in those boots for months. This boot was found at the dam Mr. Hale is accused of destroying, Eliza stated. She then held it closer to the Reverend, pointing to the crevices of the sole, which were packed with a dark, sticky substance. "And this is not just mud, it's pine tar." She looked toward the back of the church. "Jebediah, you're the town carpenter. You've worked with every kind of wood and sealant." An old man with a face like a weathered plank and hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor stood up slowly. "That's right. Miss Hart, what kind of tar do you use to seal fresh-cut pine when you want to make it waterproof for, say, a water pipe?" Jebediah squinted at the boot. "Well now, for a job like that, you'd use a specific mix. Hot pine tar with a bit of rosin to make it set hard. Has a real particular smell to it, acrid-like." Eliza held the boot out. The old carpenter walked forward, took it, and sniffed it deeply. He scraped a small amount of the black substance out with a thumbnail and rubbed it. He nodded slowly. "That's it," he said, his voice certain. "That's the exact stuff you'd use for a new pipeline. No doubt about it." He placed the boot back on the table and looked squarely at Marshal Pike, whose face had gone the color of spoiled milk. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was tangible. It was a boot, and it was tar, and it told a story that everyone in the room could understand. Dodd's lawyer, seeing his case begin to unravel, immediately went on the offensive. He launched into a grand, sweeping speech, his voice filling the church. He spoke of manifest destiny, of the unstoppable march of progress. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, gesturing to the silent, anxious faces, "let us not get bogged down in trivial matters of mud and boots. The real issue here is the future. The railroad is a great and powerful engine of prosperity, and it requires fuel. It requires water. Mr. Dodd, in his great civic foresight, has made a private arrangement to supply that water. Is it not the American way for a private citizen to develop a resource for the good of all? This is not theft. It is enterprise. To stand in the way of this is to stand in the way of civilization itself. Do you want Sagebrush Crossing to remain a dusty, forgotten backwater, or do you want it to have a future?" The speech was powerful, and it planted seeds of doubt and greed in the hearts of some. The promise of prosperity was a potent one. The weight of it all, the debt, the accusations, the slick words of the lawyer, the memory of the night in the ravine pressed down on Coulter. He felt the town wavering, felt the solid ground of his purpose turning to sand. He was a man of action, of fences and cattle, not of words and legal tricks. He was losing. He could see the end of the line, his ranch gone, his name disgraced, maybe a noose waiting for him. The old instinct to cut his losses, to stop the bleeding, rose up in him. He stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. "There's no need to wait 2 days," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. He looked at Dodd, a man he had come to loathe with every fiber of his being. "I'll sign over the herd." "It should be enough to cover the rest of the debt." A gasp went through the room. It was a surrender. Dodd's lips curved into a triumphant smirk. He produced a bill of sale from his inner pocket as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Coulter reached for the pen. This was it, the end of the Blue Coyote, the end of his father's dream, of Dean's life. It was a failure, but at least it would be a quiet one. He could leave, right away, and never look back. His hand was halfway to the paper when another hand, smaller but stronger than his own, covered it. Eliza. She had moved to his side so quietly he hadn't noticed. She didn't look at him. She looked at Dodd, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "No," she said, her voice low but ringing with absolute conviction. She turned to Coulter, her fingers tightening on his hand. "You sell the herd. What's left to live for, a name on a deed? The land is nothing without the life you build on it. Don't let him take that from you." Her words were a bucket of cold water in his face, waking him from his stupor of defeat. He looked at his hand, then at her fierce, determined face. He slowly pulled his hand back from the paper. The meeting dissolved in a state of unresolved tension, with the Reverend firmly adjourning all matters for 2 days. The townspeople filed out, their conversations now a low, angry buzz. Coulter and Eliza were among the last to leave, stepping out from the stuffy church into a world of gray mist and fine, persistent drizzle. They stood on the covered porch, the rain making a soft, drumming sound on the wooden roof. They were alone. Coulter looked out at the muddy street, at the bleak, wet world. He had come so close to giving it all away. He had been ready to run again. She had stopped him. He turned to face her. The fine mist had beaded in her hair, making it shine. Her face, smudged with weariness, was the most honest thing he had seen in years. A wave of feeling so powerful it stole his breath washed over him. Gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something warmer that he didn't dare put a name to. Acting on an impulse that was older and truer than all his fear, he closed the small distance between them. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. He saw the surprise in her eyes, the slight parting of her lips. He leaned in, intending to kiss her, to thank her in the only way that felt adequate. But then the old habits, the deep-worn instincts of a lifetime of retreat, kicked in. The ghost of Dean whispered in his ear. The shadow of the man at Gray Fork fell over him. He was trouble. He was damaged goods. What right did he have to pull her into his storm? He stopped, his face inches from hers. The moment hung between them, fragile as a spider's web. He hesitated, and in hesitating, he ran. He didn't move his feet, but he retreated back inside himself, his expression closing off, the light in his eyes dimming. Eliza saw it all. She saw the impulse, the fear, and the retreat. She didn't lean in to close the gap. She didn't turn away. Instead, she took a small half-step back, not in rejection, but to give the truth room to breathe between them. Her gray-blue eyes held his, unwavering. "Don't run anymore," she whispered, her voice barely a sound in the quiet rain. She was not just talking about the kiss. She was talking about everything. Go deeper, even when it's frightening. The 2 days passed under a sky the color of slate. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained, a heavy, oppressive blanket that seemed to muffle all sound and sap the energy from the town. Sagebrush Crossing was holding its breath. The telegraph key in Eliza's office chattered incessantly as she sent inquiries to Cheyenne, her brow furrowed in concentration. Coulter spent the time at the Blue Coyote, not working, but watching. He watched the water level in the Mesquite well, which, fed by the runoff from the storm, was slowly, miraculously rising. He was watching for a sign, for some indication of which way the world would tilt. On the morning of the 3rd day, just as the sun was finally managing to burn a few weak holes in the cloud cover, a new kind of wagon rolled into town. It was not a farmer's buckboard or a rancher's supply wagon. It was a professional surveyor's wagon. sturdy and efficient, loaded with tripods, chains, and strange-looking brass instruments that glinted in the pale light. 3 men rode with it, their clothes practical and clean, their faces weathered not by poverty but by the sun and wind of 1,000 miles of open country. They looked like men who believed in straight lines and hard numbers. Their leader, a man with a square jaw and clear, intelligent eyes, introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, chief engineer for the Union Pacific Survey Team. He asked for the local telegraph operator and was directed to Eliza's forge. The entire town seemed to follow him. When Harrison entered the smithy, it was already crowded. Reverend Greer was there, as were Coulter, Eliza, and a dozen other townspeople who had gathered as if drawn by an invisible current. Silas Dodd and his lawyer stood near the back, their faces tight with forced composure. "I'm Harrison," the engineer said, his voice crisp and businesslike as he addressed Eliza. "I received your telegraphs. There seems to be some confusion about our proposed route." "There is," Eliza said simply. She gestured to the pine table, which had been moved from the church to her workshop. Dodd's grand, fraudulent map was still unrolled upon it. Harrison walked over to the table. He looked at the map for no more than 3 seconds, a flicker of professional disdain crossing his face. "Well, that's your first problem," he said, his tone dismissive. "This isn't our map." A collective gasp went through the room. "I assure you, sir," Dodd's lawyer interjected, stepping forward, "that map was delivered from your office in Cheyenne and bears your official seal." Harrison picked up a corner of the map, rubbing the thick paper between his thumb and forefinger. "The paper is wrong. The topographical delineations are amateurish, and the lettering is from a print set we haven't used in 5 years. He then pointed to the impressive red wax seal at the bottom. "And this," he said with a short, humorless laugh, "is a forgery, a clumsy one. At that, the eagle's left wing is missing a feather." He reached into his own satchel and pulled out a legitimate document, slapping it down on the table next to Dodd's forgery. "This is our seal," he said. The difference was suddenly, glaringly obvious. The eagle on Harrison's document was sharper, more detailed. The one on Dodd's map was a crude imitation. The silence in the room was absolute. Silas Dodd's face, which had been a mask of confidence, began to crumble. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. Just then, the town clerk, a mousy man named Abernathy, who had been dispatched by the Reverend 2 days prior to search the county records, pushed his way through the crowd. He was panting, his face flushed with a mixture of excitement and terror. "Reverend, I found it," he squeaked, holding up a heavy, cast-iron object. It was a seal press, the kind used for notarizing official documents. It was in the back of the land office archives, under a pile of old tax ledgers. "This is the official county seal press, the one we thought was lost." Reverend Greer took the press and examined it. He then looked at the wax impression on the arrest warrant Pike had tried to serve Coulter. They were a perfect match. The warrant was technically legal, pressed with the county's own seal. "But how?" the Reverend began. "It was Jebediah, the old carpenter, who provided the final piece. He had been staring at the fraudulent seal on Dodd's map, a thoughtful frown on his weathered face. "That fake seal," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble. "The one Mr. Harrison pointed out. The craftsmanship is poor, but the metal, it's a lead-tin alloy. Not the kind of thing you'd make a proper seal from. But it's the exact same mix that Silas Dodd ordered a few months back for his, what did you call it? Mr. Dodd, his little hobby forge." Every head turned to Dodd. The banker had purchased a small, private furnace and casting set, claiming it was for a gentleman's hobby of casting lead soldiers. But lead and tin were also the primary metals used for creating counterfeit document seals. The hobby forge was a cover. He had cast the fake railroad seal himself. The web of lies, so carefully constructed, had come apart all at once. The fake map, the real warrant, the boot, the pine tar, the hobby forge, each was a thread. And now they had all been pulled, unraveling Dodd's entire scheme in front of the very people he had sought to control. All eyes now fell on the last, pathetic piece of the conspiracy, Marshal Pike. He stood shivering, his face ashen. He looked at Dodd, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes, but the banker's face was a mask of cold fury. There was no help there. Pike's gaze then drifted to Coulter, to Eliza, and finally to the hard, expectant faces of the townspeople. He was a man without allies, a man drowning in the consequences of his own cowardice. He made a small, wretched sound, a cross between a sob and a cough. Then, with a gesture of final, abject surrender, he unpinned the tarnished silver star from his vest. He held it in his trembling hand for a moment before letting it fall to the dirt floor of the forge with a soft, pathetic clink. "He made me do it," Pike whispered, his voice cracking. "Dodd, he holds the note on my property. He said he'd ruin me." He looked at Reverend Greer, tears now openly streaming down his face. The warrant was his idea. He had it all written out. He just needed the seal. He told me if I didn't play along, he'd destroy me. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply turned and stumbled out of the forge, a man no longer in a uniform, just a broken man in a muddy coat, walking away from the life he had sold so cheaply. That evening, something remarkable happened. It began with a single light. Little Ruthie, holding her father's hand, carried a small lantern to the community well behind the forge. She placed it on the stone lip, its small, golden flame a tiny beacon in the gathering dusk. Then another family came, and another. Soon, a silent procession of townspeople made its way through the twilight, not to the church for prayer, but out to the northern pasture, to the mesquite well. They came on foot and in wagons, carrying lanterns and torches. They formed a wide, silent circle around the well, their lights pushing back the darkness, creating an island of warmth and community in the vast, empty landscape. Coulter and Eliza stood together, watching them come. The rescue at the town well had been an act of individual courage. This was something different. This was an act of collective reclamation. Coulter lowered a bucket into the well and drew it up. Hand over hand, the water was high, nearly to the top, cold and clear and abundant. The storm and the broken dam had replenished it. Nature itself had provided the final, irrefutable proof of the theft. The people murmured, their voices low and full of a quiet, righteous anger. The water was theirs, this land was theirs. It was from this circle of light that they saw the lone rider, a frantic, dark figure urging his horse into a gallop, heading not for the town, but for the open plains to the east. It was Silas Dodd. He was running. A ripple of angry shouts went through the crowd. A few men started for their horses, their hands dropping to their pistols. Vengeance was a simple, satisfying answer. Coulter felt the old, familiar instinct surge within him. To chase, to conquer, to end the fight with the finality of a gunshot, but he didn't move. He looked at the circle of lanterns, at the faces of his neighbors, old and young, etched in the warm glow. He looked at Eliza, standing beside him, her expression calm and steady. Violence was Dodd's way. It was the way of the man he used to be. He stayed where he was. Dodd's escape route would take him past the main gate of the Blue Coyote Ranch. He was almost there when he saw figures emerge from the shadows, blocking his path. It was not a posse of armed men. It was Eliza, Jebediah the carpenter, and the town's two other blacksmiths. They were not carrying guns. They were carrying a massive, freshly hewn timber beam, the central support for a new bridge. With a coordinated grunt of effort, they lifted the heavy beam and dropped it into the heavy iron brackets on either side of the gate, creating an impassable barricade. It was not an act of violence. It was an act of construction. They had not drawn a weapon. They had closed a gate. Dodd reined in his horse, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was trapped, not by a bullet, but by the quiet, unshakable will of the community he had tried to break. The next morning, the church bell rang, not for a service, but for a reckoning. The town gathered once more. Dodd was there, his face sullen, his fine suit rumpled, his escape cut off. Reverend Greer stood before the assembly and read from a simple, handwritten document. It was not a legal judgment from a distant court, but a covenant, a set of terms agreed upon by the people of Sagebrush Crossing. It declared all of Silas Dodd's punitive fines and fees null and void. It required him to pay, from his own pocket, for a team of men to clear the last of the debris from the wash and permanently restore the channel of the spring. His private enterprise was to be undone at his own expense. When the Reverend finished reading, Mr. Harrison, the railroad engineer, stepped forward. "The Union Pacific still requires a water stop in this valley," he announced, "and this well," he gestured in the direction of the mesquite, "is the ideal location. We are prepared to offer a contract, not to one man, but to the town. We will pay a fair price, per gallon, for every gallon we take. The payments will be made to a town council, to be used for the benefit of all, not deposited into the account of a single, private citizen." A cheer went up. It was a future, a real one, built not on a lie, but on a fair exchange. As night fell, the wind that had relentlessly scoured the valley for weeks finally died down. A profound stillness settled over the land. The church bell rang out one last time, its clear, steady tone not a call to prayer, but a declaration of a new beginning. All around the mesquite well, the lanterns from the night before still burned, having been refilled and relit. They formed a constellation of small, determined lights in the vast darkness. The greedy shadow that one man had cast over the town had not been destroyed in a blaze of glory. It had simply, finally, been diminished by the collective light of many. The dawn that followed the town's victory was unlike any other. It was not the angry red of the hunter's moon, nor the oppressive gray of the rains. It was a quiet, clean light, the color of pearl and watered-down gold, that seemed to wash the valley in a fragile, tentative peace. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new beginnings. In this stillness, the future arrived, not with the rumble of a train, but with the quiet rustle of an envelope. The letter was for Eliza. It had arrived on the early stage, bearing the postmark of Santa Vespera, a bustling city 200 miles to the south, a place known for its foundries and factories. The offer inside was everything a woman in her position was supposed to want. It was from the Santa Vespera Ironworks, the largest foundry in the territory. They had heard of her skill, of a woman who could not only shoe a horse, but also repair complex machinery and maintain a telegraph line. They were offering her a position as a chief mechanic and forge master. The salary was double what she could ever hope to make in Sagebrush Crossing. The work would be in a modern, well-equipped facility with steam-powered hammers and a roof that didn't leak. It was a clean job, a respectable job. It was a way out, an escape from the dust, the poverty, the constant struggle. It was a ladder out of the well. She read it twice, standing in the doorway of her smithy as the sun crested the mesas. The paper felt heavy and foreign in her hand, a dispatch from another world, another life she could be living. Santa Vespera. The name itself sounded like a promise. Clean hands, a steady wage, a world where her value was measured in dollars and contracts, not in sacks of potatoes and mended tin soldiers. Her gaze drifted across the street, toward the livery stable. Coulter was there, leading Ash out into the morning light. He moved with a new purpose, his shoulders straighter than they had been a week ago. The haunted, hunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary resolve. He had faced his ghosts, and while they might never fully disappear, they no longer had their hands on the reins. He saw her watching and gave a slow nod. Later that morning, he sought her out. He found her staring at the ashes of her forge, the fire unlit for the first time in days. "The town council is meeting this afternoon," he said, his voice low. "Talking about Harrison's offer. How to manage the water contract? That's good," she replied, her voice distant. She was still holding the letter. He saw the envelope in her hand, saw the strange, faraway look in her eyes. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle signs of the land, that a change was coming. "You're thinking of leaving," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a quiet statement of fact. She didn't deny it. She handed him the letter. He read it, his expression unreadable. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at the calloused, capable hands that held the ticket to a different life. "It's a good offer," he finally said, his voice rough. A clean life. You've earned it. He looked around the dusty, cluttered smithy, at the patched bellows and the worn anvil. You've done more than your share of mending broken things in this town. He was giving her an easy way out. He was stepping aside, making her choice simpler. But Eliza found that she didn't want it to be simple. And what about you, she asked, her gaze direct. What will you do, the ranch? He said, I'll rebuild the herd. The water contract will help. It'll be a long road, but it's my road. He paused, then took a step closer. But I was thinking, this town, it needs more than a ranch. It needs a center, the well behind your forge. That's where everything changed. That's where the town found its courage. He looked at her, his eyes full of a startling, clear-eyed vision. I was thinking of a new sign, one that hangs right there, by the well. It would say, Heart Hail Forging Correspondence. We could fix what's broken, and we could keep the town connected. We could teach the children their letters, like you do with Ruthie. We could teach them a trade. We could build something, together. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was something more grounded, more real. It was a proposal of a shared life, a shared labor, a partnership forged not in a church, but in the heart of the community. The offer was beautiful, and it terrified her. She looked at him, at this man who had walked back from the edge of his own despair, and a cold fear washed over her. Alistair Finch, the doctor, had wanted her when she was whole and unburdened, the moment she became a woman with problems to be solved. With a father's debts and a forge to run, he had vanished. Now, here was Coulter Hale, a man she had helped pull from the depths. Was that all she was to him? A convenient solution, a strong shoulder to lean on while he healed. The fear found its voice. I'm not a tool to be used. Coulter, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp as a shard of steel. I'm not just a mending shoulder for broken men to lean on until they're strong enough to walk on their own again. The words hung in the air between them, stark and painful. Coulter's face tightened as if he'd been struck. He didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He just looked at her. And in his eyes, she saw not hurt pride, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. He turned without a word and walked out of the smithy. He went to his horse, Ash, who was tied to a nearby post. He untied the reins. Then he walked back to her, stopping a few feet away. He held out the worn leather straps. You hold them, he said, his voice quiet but firm. We steer together. The gesture was so simple, so profound. It cut through all of her fear. A cowboy's reins were his life, his control, his connection to the freedom and power of his horse. To hand them over was the ultimate act of trust, of partnership. He wasn't asking her to follow him. He was asking her to help him find the way. She didn't take the reins, not yet, but the fear in her heart began to recede. Later that day, they worked. There was a debt to be paid to the town, a wound to be healed. The rotten planks that had covered the well behind the forge, the ones that had given way under Ruthie, lay in a broken pile. They had to be replaced. Coulter brought fresh, strong timbers from the livery. Eliza brought her tools. They worked under the pale afternoon sun, a team of two. There was no need for words. Their movements fell into a natural, easy rhythm. The sharp rasp of Coulter's saw cutting the planks to size, the solid, ringing report of Eliza's hammer driving the long iron nails home. Their hands often brushed as they positioned a board. Their shoulders bumped as they leaned into their work. Each touch was an unspoken sentence, a confirmation of the truce between them. Sweat beaded on their foreheads and ran down their temples, dripping onto the fresh pine boards like a salt rain, baptizing the new wood. At one point, a small figure appeared, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle. It was Ruthie. She walked right up to the edge of the well that had almost claimed her, and looked down into its newly secured depths without a trace of fear. Mama sent some cornbread, she said, her voice clear and bright. She handed the warm bundle to Eliza. She said you'd be hungry. Thank you, sweet girl, Eliza said, her voice thick. It's not scary anymore, Ruthie said, pointing down into the well. It was scary when it didn't have a name, but now we just call it the Ruthie Well. And it's not scary if you can call its name? She smiled, a gap-toothed, innocent smile that was brighter than the sun, and then skipped away. They ate the cornbread in silence, the simple, honest taste of it. A communion. As they were packing up their tools, another figure approached, walking with a slow, hesitant gait. It was Pike. He was no longer the marshal, just a man in a rumpled coat. He looked older, smaller, stripped of his authority. He stopped a few yards away, twisting his hat in his hands. I have some seasoned oak at my place," he said, his eyes on the ground. "Left over from when I built my porch. It's stronger than pine. It would make a better frame for this." He looked up, just for a second, his eyes meeting Coulter's. There was no apology in his voice, because words were too cheap for what he had done. There was only the offer, a small, humble contribution, a piece of his own home to make the town's center safer. "Bring it by in the morning," Coulter said, his voice neutral. Pike nodded, a flicker of profound relief in his eyes. He turned and walked away, a man taking the first, tentative step on a long, hard road back to himself. That night, Eliza sat alone at the small desk in her telegraph office. The lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light on the clutter of her work. She took out 2 pieces of paper. One was the letter from the Santa Vespera Ironworks, its crisp, clean edges a stark contrast to the rough, handmade paper she used for her own correspondence. She dipped her pen in the inkwell. She began to write. It was a short letter, polite and direct. She thanked the Ironworks for their generous offer. She wished them well in their search for a suitable candidate. She wrote that she had decided to remain in Sagebrush Crossing, as she had entered into a new business partnership that required her full attention. She signed her name. She did not look at the letter from Santa Vespera again. She simply folded her own letter, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it. She watched the dark ink of her signature soak into the paper, the letters spreading, becoming a permanent part of the page. The ink blotted slow. Her hand did not tremble. The sunrise was a slow pour of liquid gold, spilling over the dark rim of the mesas and flowing down into the valley. It touched the new sign first. The sign was made of a single, thick plank of seasoned oak. The wood Pike had brought as a penitent's offering. The letters had been carved deep and clean by Jebediah, then branded and sealed by Eliza's own hand. They were simple, strong, and clear heart-hail forging correspondence. It hung from a new crossbeam between the smithy and the newly repaired well, a bridge between 2 worlds, a declaration of a future built from the pieces of a broken past. The morning light caught the edges of the letters, making them glow. Inside the smithy, which was now also a makeshift post office and classroom, a quiet ceremony was taking place. The large, open space had been cleaned and organized. The tools were hung in their proper places, the floor swept clean of all but the most stubborn coal dust. On a newly built shelf above the main workbench sat 2 objects, placed side by side like offerings on an altar. One was Eliza's father's favorite hammer, its hickory handle worn smooth and dark with the sweat of 1,000 working days, its head dented and scarred from a lifetime of shaping iron. The other was a faded blue kerchief, folded into a neat, small square. Coulter stood before the shelf, the kerchief in his hand. He held it for a long moment, the rough, salt-stiffened fabric a familiar weight in his palm. He could smell the faint, ghostly scent of trail dust and his brother's sweat. This small piece of cloth was the last tangible piece of Dean he had, a relic of his greatest failure. For years, he had carried it like a stone in his pocket, a constant, abrasive reminder. Now, he was not throwing it away. He was not burying it. He was giving it a place. With a slow, deliberate movement, he placed the folded kerchief on the shelf, right next to the heavy, solid presence of the hammer. The past was not being erased. It was being acknowledged, given a place of honor where it could be seen, where it could rest. It was no longer a ghost to be run from, but an ancestor to be remembered. It would stand witness to the work that was to come. Outside, The town was already stirring, and the day's first ritual was beginning. A line was forming at the mesquite well on the edge of the Blue Coyote land. It was not a frantic, shoving crowd, but an orderly queue. Each family came with a single bucket. They filled it from the high, clear water, exchanged a quiet greeting with their neighbor, and walked back to their homes. There was no hoarding, no suspicion. The water was for everyone, and everyone understood there was enough. It was a simple, profound act of communal trust. A quiet revolution played out one bucket at a time. Later that morning, Reverend Greer walked to the porch of the newly designated town hall, what had once been Silas Dodd's bank. In his hands, he held a large sheet of paper. He tacked it firmly to the central post, the same post where Dodd's foreclosure notice had once been nailed. This new document was titled, in the Reverend's neat, careful script, the Sagebrush Crossing Water Covenant. It laid out the terms of the agreement with the railroad and the rules for the community's use of the shared water. It was simple, fair, and direct. Below the text were the signatures, not of a single banker or a distant judge, but of nearly every man and woman in the valley. It was their law, written in their own hands. The rest of the day was filled with the sounds of labor. The clang of Eliza's hammer from the forge, the rhythmic rasp of Coulter's saw as he cut new posts for the corral, the shouts of men working to clear the last of the debris from the canyon wash. The town was not resting on its victory. It was building on it. As dusk began to settle, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, Eliza came out of the forge. She wiped her hands on a rag, her face smudged with soot and sweat, her body tired in the satisfying way that only hard work can bring. Coulter was at the well, washing the grime of the day from his hands and face, the cool water a balm on his sun-baked skin. He looked up as she approached. They stood together in the gathering twilight, in the quiet space between the forge and the well. The air was cooling, carrying the scent of hot iron from her workshop and the clean, damp smell of the earth. She looked at him, at the new lines of peace that had settled around his eyes, at the way he stood his ground, no longer poised to run. She saw the scars, both the visible ones and the ones she knew lay hidden beneath. She reached out and placed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, rhythmic beat beneath the layers of cotton and old scar tissue. It was the sound of a life that had been broken and had begun to heal. She thought of her own scars, the ones left by Alistair Finch's abandonment and her father's death. She thought of all the hard, sharp edges that life had given both of them. "Go deeper," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the evening air. Her eyes held his, her gaze unwavering. But this time, don't run from what you find. It was the echo of her words from the bottom of the well, but now it meant something more. It was not a challenge to rescue a child. It was an invitation to rescue each other. Coulter did not speak. He did not make a grand promise he might not be able to keep. He simply looked down into her stormy gray-blue eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acceptance, a covenant. He then gently took the hand that rested on his chest, raised it to his lips, and turned it over, pressing a soft kiss into the center of her calloused palm. He lifted his other hand to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion or fairy tale romance. It was slow and sure, a kiss that tasted of well water and wood smoke, of sweat and resolution. It was a kiss that felt like the driving of a foundation stone, a promise of shared labor, of mornings of hard work and evenings of quiet companionship. It was a kiss that took place in the long, comforting shadow of the well. As they stood there, the church bell began to toll. Not an alarm, but simply to mark the end of the day. From the livery. Ash gave a soft, contented whicker. The smell of the cooling iron from the forge mingled with the sweet, damp scent of the high plains grass. A new life, a shared one, was beginning. Not with a vow, but with the simple, profound reality of their work and their presence. And from far off, a sound that was no longer a threat drifted on the still night air, the long, lonely whistle of a train. making its steady way across the vast, dark expanse of the West. Sagebrush Crossing was no longer sleeping, waiting for its fate, and two people, standing by a well in the heart of the valley, were no longer running. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to build a community around these tales, so please leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support. We appreciate every one of you.